The history of energy is really a veritable history of modernity. The two are essentially indistinguishable. And perhaps even more surprising is just how very short that history is. If you lived in the first half of the 19th century, you almost certainly worked in agriculture. In 1830, 70% of the United States population was employed in agriculture. And that work was backbreaking. An acre of wheat took 56 hours to farm, and it produced only 15 bushels of wheat. Your day began at dawn, and it ended at dark, because there was no artificial light. Heat was produced by burning wood. Transportation was largely driven by animals. And if you didn't immigrate, you probably never traveled more than 50 miles from where you were born. Artificial light was one of society's greatest needs, most pressing needs at that point. And by the middle of the 19th century, whale oil had emerged as the source of choice for light. But that resource was finite. It was clearly limited. Whales that were harvested primarily for oil, but also for meat, were becoming scarce. By 1860, the industry was in severe decline. Whales were scarce, competition was increasing, fleets had to travel ever farther from home to find new whales to hunt. Whale oil for illumination became too expensive for the average consumer. A new technology was required. Already by 1846, Adam Gessner, a Canadian geologist, had demonstrated that a liquid that he called kerosene could be distilled from coal. And it was a liquid that had ideal properties for illumination, really much better than whale oil. But production was a significant problem. And various processes to extract kerosene from coal were really not economically viable. Oil seeps had been known in Pennsylvania, of course, for many years. But in 1859, the first well was drilled in Titusville, and the boom was on. Already, almost from the very beginning, a powerful relationship emerged between energy use and per capita GDP. The ready availability of cheap, clean, dependable light changed the world in ways that today, for us, seem almost hard to imagine. Today, for instance, we take light for granted. But even at the end of the 19th century, the average person used only about 5 kilolumens of light. Today, the average person uses about 60 megalumen hours, a 12,000-fold increase. But with access to artificial light, the workday lengthened, productivity increased, new forms of energy enabled cooking, improving diets. Together, even these seemingly modest changes initiated an inexorable rise in GDP. In the second half of the 19th century, oil was still used primarily for the production of kerosene. What we call today gasoline was largely a waste byproduct. But other innovative forces were at work. Although several investors had experimented with producing light by passing electric current through a filament from Sir Humphrey Davy in 1802, none were yet practical. But the world changed again in 1879 when Thomas Edison illuminated a device by passing an electric current through a carbon filament that was held in a vacuum. Electric light was a practical reality. Kerosene prices plunged. But other forces were at work. Other technologies were on the horizon. In 1908, the first Model T rolled off the assembly line, introducing for the first time affordable, reliable, gasoline-based transportation. By 1914, a Model T took only 93 minutes to assemble on the Ford assembly line. And only 20 years after its introduction, 18 million vehicles were registered in America. In 1903, the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk, ushering in an entirely new mode of transportation, again, a mode of transportation dependent on liquid fuels. The link between energy and prosperity becomes even clearer, and for reasons today that seem obvious. As I mentioned, in 1830, 70% of the American labor force was involved in agriculture. That number fell to 41% by the turn of the century, and at the end of the Second World War, less than 7% of American workers were involved in farm labor. That acre of wheat that took 56 hours to produce 15 bushels now took 3 hours to produce and produced 31 bushels, a 50-fold increase in productivity. Your heat came from oil or coal, and you traveled by car. Those trends only accelerated during the second half of the 20th century as the full range of possibilities afforded by cheap, abundant energy became clear. Today, although less than 2% of American workforce is involved in agriculture, the United States is a net exporter of food, producing 50%, over 50% of the world's corn crop. In 1980, 6 of the top 10 corporations worldwide were oil companies. Energy and prosperity continued to rise in lockstep throughout the centuries. One of the most profound changes the planet has ever seen continued. Access to cheap, abundant energy increased real per capita GDP by over 5-fold over the course of a single century. But while those changes have afforded humanity almost unimaginable opportunity and prosperity, problems lurk just beyond the horizon. The resource that we depend on, oil, coal, natural gas, is clearly finite. Okay? We can have a reasoned and reasonable debate about whether that resource will last us for another 50 years or another 200 years. But it is absolutely a finite resource. The extraction and use of that resource carries a clear environmental cost. We can have a reasoned and rational debate about what fraction of global warming is anthropogenic, but it's impossible to deny the environmental consequences of the extraction and use of conventional energy resources. That push to a new energy future will be exacerbated by an emerging world. If the application of energy produces prosperity, it has been applied unevenly. With roughly 5% of the world's population, the United States consumes about a quarter of the world's energy. And that is perhaps not such a surprise, since the United States is about a quarter of the world's population. But still, fully 1/4 of this planet has never seen an on-off switch, has no access at all to energy services, and a much larger fraction has only intermittent access. The growth of the so-called BRICS, especially India and China, over the next few decades will have a profound impact on energy resources, and then the rest of the developed world beyond that. So against this backdrop, against this pressing need for new access to energy resources, the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Energy, or ARPA-E, was created in 2007. The agency actually grew out of a National Academies report, the Rising Above the Gathering Storm report. That report was commissioned by the Congress in 2004 and asked the National Academies to consider aspects of science and technology that would be of special relevance to the United States in coming decades. The academies focused on 2 areas in that report. The first was science education, science literacy, and the second was energy. And one of their recommendations was for the creation of a new agency to be broadly modeled after the well-known and very successful Defense Advanced Research Projects, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, but focused on energy. So the agency was created under the America Competes Act in 2007 in the Bush administration and funded for the first time under the Recovery Act in 2009. The agency uses a very different model than most scientific agencies, where it brings the very best scientists and engineers that America has to offer to Washington for a short period of time. Program directors are with us typically only for 3 years, and then they'll return to academia, to the national labs, to the private sector to continue their lives there. We fund projects really in 2 ways. We've run a couple of open solicitations, and we'll continue to do that on a fairly regular basis, where we take all comers from across the entire energy landscape, as well as making specific investments in focused projects that are developed by these program directors that come to Washington to visit us for a period of time. And we'll talk about some of those programs today. ARPA-E is a little bit different from other agencies in Washington as well, in that we're really charged with funding, with supporting, identifying, developing transformational technologies. So what we won't do at ARPA-E is take existing technologies and improve them by driving them down their existing learning curves. It's not that that's not an important thing to do, it's just not what we do at ARPA-E. Rather, our charge is to take technologies and to put them onto fundamentally new learning curves. And that's what we mean by the term transformational. Now, a technology being transformational is not sufficient for it to be adopted in the market. And if we think about the evolution of transportation, the development of the first vehicles, the first automobiles, were certainly transformational in the sense that they put transportation onto a fundamentally new learning curve. But they weren't disruptive in the marketplace. They had basically no impact at all on the horse and buggy market or on animal-powered transportation because they were too expensive and too unreliable. Rather, what really changed the game, the disruptive change in transportation came with the advent of the Model T, cheap, reliable, gasoline-powered transportation. So at ARPA-E, our job is to start technologies onto fundamentally new learning curves, to make sure there's no fundamental reason that they couldn't be disruptive, but then to let other agencies in the marketplace drive them down their learning curve to the point, hopefully, where they become transformational. So with a little bit of a background on our agency, what I wanted to do then was to tell you about some of the projects that we're working on, some of the programs and projects that we're working on, largely to illustrate how our agency thinks and the kinds of things that we do. And so I'll focus my remarks today on liquid fuels for transportation, on the transportation sector more broadly. We certainly have lots of activities in stationary power, but today we'll talk primarily about transportation. So let's think about transportation. Today, transportation is powered primarily by liquid fuels, by gasoline, by diesel, and by aviation fuel. So if we're going to talk about transportation and liquid fuels, it's useful to stop for a moment or two and to think about exactly how much oil we use. The United States right now uses about 1 cubic mile of oil a year. 1 cubic mile of oil a year. All right? How big is 1 cubic mile? Cubic mile is equal to the volume of about 1,700 of the Great Pyramids. That's a big number. Another demonstration of the scale that we use energy at. The Deepwater Horizon accident, where BP lost a rig in the Gulf, exploded, burned, and sank. And as you know, the rams that were designed to shear that pipe and stop the flow of oil failed, and that thing laid at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico for about 4 months, spewing oil. So every night at 6 o'clock we turned on the news and we watched that thing spewing oil into the Gulf. The total amount of oil that was lost in the Deepwater Horizon accident was about 1/4 of 1 day's use of oil for the United States. So let's think about liquid fuels for transportation and about ways that we might be able to use liquid fuels for transportation in a sustainable fashion. If you think about it, right, all liquid fuels for transportation involve taking solar photons. We've got to start with solar photons because that's the only energy input that we have to the planet, and using some mechanism to capture the energy in those solar photons and store them in chemical bonds in a way that we can use them later, right? Photosynthesis does that. Photosynthesis does that all by itself. And today, all of the fuels that we use, whether it's oil that we drill out of the ground or whether the modern biofuels, however they're produced, have captured that solar energy, stored that energy in chemical bonds through the action of photosynthesis. But there's problems with photosynthesis. Photosynthesis was designed to make plants, not to make liquid fuels. And it's not a terribly efficient process from the perspective of storing energy. So if I ask myself, let's take the very best dedicated energy biocrops that we have, high biomass sorghum or something like that. We grow those crops here in Texas. We can produce about 12 dry tons of biomass per acre per year. It's got a heating value of maybe 8,000 BTUs a pound. I can work that backwards and I can say, all right, the energy that I have stored in chemical bonds at the end of this, what does that represent as a fraction of the total solar radiation that fell on that acre of land over the course of a year? And the answer is it's about 3 days. Okay? It's about 3 days. So less than 1% of the energy that falls on these plants ends up stored in chemical bonds in a way that we might be able to use them. Well, maybe we should take a step back even further, right? Plants were not developed to make fuel for us. They happen to make fuel for us. They store solar energy in chemical bonds in a way that we can convert it into fuel later. But plants weren't designed to produce liquid fuels. They produce lignocellulose. They produce starch. If they're seed crops, they produce all sorts of things. But they're not designed to produce fuel. But what if they were? What if we could instead make plants that were designed to produce liquid fuels? What kinds of things would we do? Well, the first thing that we would do is we would not make the plant leaves green, right? The fact that plant leaves are green means that right off the bat, they're only capable of absorbing about half the solar spectrum that lands on them. The rest gets reflected away or converted to heat. What you'd really want would be black leaves, leaves that would absorb all of the light that fell on them. You wouldn't want them to make sugars. You'd want them to make lipids. You'd want them to make hydrocarbons because that has the highest energy density. That's the sorts of things that we want to provide the motive force for transportation. And we'd also want to optimize them. I mentioned that we only manage to save about 1% of the energy that lands on them. Surely there would be a way to do this. And the Petro program, Plants Engineered to Replace Oil, is a program at ARPA-E that's designed to answer these questions. So what kinds of things are we doing? Well, anybody who's been around a pine tree knows that pine trees make sap. But pine trees have evolved to make just enough sap to heal wounds and to fight off attacks by insects and parasites. What if we could make pine trees that would produce very large quantities of sap, that would produce maybe 20 or 25% of the dry weight of the tree as a liquid hydrocarbon that we could convert to a fuel? And a project that's funded through the University of Florida is asking that exact question. I mentioned dedicated energy crops. We know now that we have a whole family of crops that are designed to produce large quantities of biomass. But again, they're producing biomass, polysaccharides that have to be broken down and then converted into a liquid fuel. What if we could make dedicated energy crops that produced oil instead of producing sugars? And a project at Ceres is taking sweet sorghum, a dedicated energy crop, and designing variants that produce lipids instead of producing sugars. But maybe we could take a step back even beyond that, right? Our planet has a staggering amount of biodiversity on it, an absolutely staggering amount of biodiversity on it. If I look at just the deep oceans, the parts of the ocean that are supposed to not have anything in them, those oceans have 300,000 times more microorganisms than there are stars in the observable universe. How many stars are there in the observable universe? Well, there's 7 with 22 zeros after. That's how many stars there are in the visible universe. And there's 300,000 times more microorganisms than that in the part of the ocean that there's not supposed to be anything in, right? And a huge fraction of that life lives in ecological niches where it doesn't have access to sunlight, so it can't live as a phototroph. And it doesn't have access to reduced carbon, so it can't live as a heterotroph. So there's this enormous array of organisms on our planet that live only on CO2 as their only source of carbon, only on inorganic carbon, but assimilate energy not through sunlight, not through reduced carbon, but from hydrogen, from reduced metal ions, from ammonia, even organisms that are capable of growing directly on electric current. Those organisms use all sorts of pathways to fix carbon other than the pathway that photosynthetic organisms use. And many of those pathways are much more efficient than those used by photosynthetic organisms. None of these pathways have ever been explored for the production of liquid fuels. And ARPA-E's electrofuels program, then, is looking at this biodiversity to produce liquid fuels from some of this biodiversity. So what kinds of projects are we doing? One project that's operating at the UCLA, this is Jim Lau, the principal investigator in this project, is looking at organisms that are capable of living on formate. So we can take CO2, inorganic carbon, electrochemically reduce it to formate, and then feed that to organisms that will use that formate both as a source of carbon and as a source of energy, producing liquid fuels in much higher efficiency than we can do through plants. But there's other ways to power transportation, surely. Electric vehicles have finally come to the fore, and this year, as you know, we have 2 mass-market electric vehicles that have finally reached the market, right? The Chevy Volt, which is a plug-in hybrid, and the Nissan Leaf, which is an all-electric vehicle. But there's a problem with electric vehicles today. We have 2 problems, really, and they both derive from the battery. The first is so-called range anxiety. These vehicles don't go far enough for us to be comfortable driving them. And the second is the enormous cost of the batteries. Battery packs are still far too expensive for these to be mass-marketed and sold as affordable cars to the American people. So what could we do about that? Well, I mentioned we have the range anxiety problem. So the Leaf is at market today. You can go and you can buy one of these, although not a great number have been sold. The battery pack for the Leaf costs about $15,000. It'll go 138 miles is what we advertise the range of the Leaf, if you don't turn on the heat and if you don't turn on the air conditioning, right? Because remember that in an internal combustion engine, you have all the heat you want free, so cabin heating is free, and the air conditioning on a vehicle is almost as big as the air conditioner on your house. So if you do have to turn on the heat, if you do have to turn on the air conditioning, the range of the Leaf goes down just by about exactly a factor of 2. So we've got a vehicle that's got a range of something on the order of 60 miles, and that's not practical for a lot of transportation. So what can we do? Well, the BEAST project at ARPA-E is designing new ways of producing batteries and new forms of batteries, metal-air batteries, batteries that have energy densities or can store an amount of energy in a given volume and in a given mass that are even higher than liquid fuels. New ways of producing batteries. So NVIA, one of the companies that we have funded, has produced a new lithium-ion battery that has a demonstrated energy capacity that's more than twice the energy density that's in the Leaf and the Volt today. So a car with an NVIA battery in it now can travel 250 miles. That's not bad. That's getting well along the way to where we need to be to overcome this range anxiety problem. But it's still very expensive. It's still a very expensive battery. It still costs on the order of $15,000. Surprising observation is how much of the battery that's in your electric vehicle you actually use for reasons of safety, for reasons of battery longevity, for warranty issues. Electric vehicles use only about a quarter of the capacity that's in the battery, right? Only about a quarter. Only about a quarter of the electrochemical potential that's in that battery is used to drive the car. Are there things that we could do that would allow us to use more of that battery? And the answer is yes, there are. So the AMPT program at ARPA-E is looking at new ways to do battery diagnostics, new ways to do battery prognostics, to increase the usable amount of the battery, right? So ARPA-E is working on a number of ways to enable the penetration of electric vehicles in a way that would revolutionize transportation in America. The history of energy is absolutely the history of prosperity. Our entire civilization is built on unfettered access to cheap energy. And today, that unfettered access is absolutely unsustainable. A lack of that access to energy is literally an existential threat to civilization as we know it. And the challenge of our time is to find new ways to produce and use energy in a sustainable fashion, one that doesn't deplete a resource and one that doesn't carry with it the environmental consequences that the ways that we use today do. The production of those means of extracting and using energy are going to take transformational change. Incremental change to the technologies we have today are not going to get the job done. At ARPA-E, we've started peeking over the horizon to look for some of those next generation revolutionary technologies, and we're excited by what we see. We look forward to identifying many more in the coming years. So thank you very much for the opportunity to come today and to tell you about what we've been doing. Thank you.